right, we will go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the NC Cask webinar series, which is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is located at the University of Colorado Boulder. My name is Heather Yoakum. I'm the social science lead here at the NC Cask, and I usually co-organize these webinars with my colleague, Imtiaz Rangwala, who is our climate science lead, but he can't be here today. So I am soloing it. So let's all cross our fingers that we don't have any tech issues today. So as always, we bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science and research and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US. So before I introduce our awesome speakers for today, just a quick word on housekeeping. So as always, we are recording this webinar, and you can find all of the recordings on our website. I just dropped that link in the chat for everyone. And then during the webinar, everyone will be muted. But you will have an ability to unmute yourselves during the Q&A after the presentation. If you do have questions that come up in the meantime, we encourage you to put those in the chat. I will be monitoring those, and we will feed those questions to our presenters first during the Q&A session so that we make sure that we get to everything. So now it's my pleasure to present or to introduce our speakers for today. So Dr. Drew Bennett is the Whitney McMillan Professor of Practice of Private Lands Stewardship at the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming. He has a PhD in resource geography from Oregon State University, a master's in geography from the University of Texas, Austin, and an MBA from the University of Denver. Woo! Go Pioneers. Drew's work focuses on strategies to balance agricultural production and the conservation of wildlife and other natural resources on private lands in the American West. He has previously worked with the Nature Conservancy on a cattle ranch in eastern Colorado and for Mesa Land Trust in western Colorado, where he assisted landowners exploring conservation opportunities for their land. And Max Lewis, our other presenter, is a current master's student in Environment, Natural Resources, and Society at the University of Wyoming. His research focuses on water conservation and private property. Originally from Maine, Max quickly found his way west to work in the United States Forest Service in Southeast Alaska, and then later with Trout Unlimited in Missoula, Montana, where he completed fisheries and stream ecology research that contributed to ecological restoration projects on private lands. In 2018, Max moved to Wyoming to study native trout and the habitats that they rely on while working for Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the Friends of the Teton River. So thank you both so much for being here today. And the title of their webinar is Uncharted Waters, Incorporating Farmer and Rancher Perspectives to Address Systematic Water Shortages in the Colorado River Basin. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Drew and Max, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate the invitation from you and Imtiaz to join the CASC today. Excited to be presenting some of this work. It's recent work and some of it's in progress that Max will present. So I'll start off by providing some high-level summaries of some of the survey work we've been doing across the basin, and then Max is going to dive deeper into some qualitative work in the upper basin that he's been leading. And I think that the sort of first part of our title here, Uncharted Waters, I think is really emblematic of where we're at right now, both in confronting the climate crisis, but especially with where we're at with the Colorado River Basin, that we don't have an analog for where we're at and where we're headed. And so we're learning in real time, and it is messy and complicated. So I think there's a great deal that we can learn from the Colorado River Basin, both for addressing the challenges in the Colorado River Basin, but also for what it might suggest about how we confront this climate crisis as it relates to water and other natural resources kind of writ large. So probably one of the most important natural resource issues that we're facing as a country in the United States today. So with that, I just want to start off by, I always hate skimming through acknowledgements at the very end of a presentation. So I want to acknowledge a bunch of folks right up front so we don't shortchange them at the very end. Really want to give a shout out to all the participants that participated in this research. We had over 1,000 landowners that participated in our survey, in dozens that have participated in interviews, in-depth interviews, and this work is not possible without the time commitment that they make. So really want to highlight how much we appreciate them. This has also been very much a collaborative effort with a number of different collaborators. First and foremost is the Western Landowners Alliance, especially Hallie Mahald and Matt Collins. This is part of a project that Western Landowners Alliance is leading that is trying to develop resources and outreach efforts with private landowners in the Colorado River Basin to address water issues. Next, some of our collaborators at the University of Wyoming, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and University of Nebraska-Reno. And last but not least, the Wyoming Survey and Analysis Center that actually facilitated and managed our survey work, Mike Dorsum, who's been a rock star to work with there. The primary funder for this project was the Walton Family Foundation, and they've been really one of the key philanthropic leaders in the Colorado River Basin. And then last but not least, Regrid gave us a very generous discount on some of the GIS data we used to develop our sample that would not have been doable with our budget without their Data with Purpose program to support research efforts. So with that, I will go ahead and dive in. I think that it's safe to say that the Colorado River Basin right now is in crisis, and it is really largely a climate-induced crisis. Estimates are that the basin water availability in the basin is down about 20% over the last century. And that has largely been attributed to human-induced climate change. And so this really is a crisis that we're facing that's driven by climate change, but that crisis is now spilling over into complex institutional and governance challenges that we are facing today. From 2000 to 2021, there was a mega drought in the basin that has reduced, I guess one estimate from Bass et al. Estimated, but just the water loss, the reduced water availability during that time period would be sufficient volume to fill Lake Mead. So very substantial water loss that's occurred over the last couple of decades, and a trend that's been going on for over a century now. One of the ways I think the most visible aspect of this climate crisis that we're seeing can be seen at Lake Mead, and this is the sort of what's become sort of the famous, people refer to them as the bathtub rings that you can see on the right-hand picture there, of showing where the water level used to be, just a decade or a little bit more ago, and the rapid decline in the water level in the lake. It's gotten to the point now where this on the left-hand side is Hoover Dam. It's gotten to the point where we're at risk of Hoover Dam reaching what's called dead pool, meaning that it's no longer able to move water. We no longer be able to move water across the dam and through the dam, which would cause the losing control of management of water in the basin below Hoover Dam. It's a state that I think nobody thinks we can actually allow it to get to that point, and some very drastic actions will happen before we'll let it get to that point. But we're getting pretty scarily close to getting there. And it's also getting close to the point where we can't generate hydropower from Hoover Dam, which provides electricity for an estimated 1.4 million people as their primary source of electricity. So just at Lake Mead and Hoover Dam alone, we are in a very severe crisis, but the crisis is much larger than that. So just to orient you to the Colorado River Basin, you can see the outline of the basin here in the black. That's the hydrologic basin, and it spans 7 states and 2 nations. It does cross over into Mexico before, in concept, reaching the Gulf of California, although there's just a trickle of water that actually crosses over into Mexico and only reaches the Gulf of California in certain years, some years. So it's and then within this area, there's also a number of tribal reservations that have water claims and through their treaty rights, and a number of different counties and other folks that are reliant, their economies that are largely reliant on water from the Colorado River Basin. So what this really sets up is a very complex transboundary, multi-level, multi-jurisdictional, cross-sector governance challenge. And I think just sort of underscoring the importance of the Colorado River to this region, you can see a number of the areas that are outside the hydrologic basin here that are in the hatched red scheme there. Those are areas that receive water that are moved out through different diversions out of the basin to be used in places like for municipal drinking water for San Diego, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Las Vegas. I guess Las Vegas is in the basin, but Denver, and Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So this is a very complex water management system, kind of writ large. About 40 million people rely on or get at least all or some of their drinking water from the Colorado River Basin. And from an agricultural standpoint, it's also really critical to the nation's agricultural industry. It generates an estimated $8 billion in direct economic activity from agricultural products, including an estimated 90% of the winter vegetables for the United States. So a really critical region to be thinking about, and really, again, underscoring the sort of complex management. I will note really quickly that the basin is administered with the upper basin and lower basin, and you can see a little black line in northeast Arizona that denotes the separation of the upper and lower basins. And that dividing line, the administrative dividing line, is at Lee Ferry, which is just below Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell. Just to orient you, that's a really important governance division that happens there, and I'll use a lot of that structure going forward and presenting some of our results, noting the upper and lower basin. And why those basins are really important from a governance standpoint. In 1922 was the signing of the Colorado River Compact. That is a very complex piece of legal compact that is probably would take a webinar or several webinars to really unpack here. I'm going to do this very succinctly, just to say that this is the first time that the states and the federal government came together to allocate which states would get which water. And the way they did it was they divided it between the upper and lower basin, allocating each of the basins 7.5 million acre feet, or 15 million acre feet total allocated between the upper and lower basins. And so you'll notice that's an absolute volume that was allocated, not a percentage of the water that was available, which I think is really critical and sort of the root of what the problem that we're facing right now. And so but the other challenge is that when this agreement was made, it was believed to be a much wetter period of time. They didn't know this at the time, but in retrospect, it was much wetter. So they thought there was much more water available, would be much more water available going forward than there currently is. And so since 2000, it's been estimated that on average each year, there's about 12.3 million acre feet available. So there's 15 million acre feet allocated to the states, and only about 12.5 million acres that are available on average. That fluctuates quite a bit. There's a lot of interannual variability, but it doesn't take, you don't have to be very good at math to know that there's a huge deficit there to cover. That also doesn't account for later allocations that were made for some of the tribal considerations of some of the treaty rights that tribes have, as well as for some allocation to Mexico. So there's a great deal of, there's a major water shortage that needs to be addressed to address this crisis. And I would argue, I think many people recognize that while we need to have water conservation across different sectors, when we really think about what's going to be the solutions that can really address the scale of the problem that we're facing, there needs to be an ag solution, an ag-based solution. And that's because agriculture accounts for about 70 to 80% of the consumptive use of water in the basin. And that varies a little bit from where you are in the basin, but really an absolutely critical, ag is really critical to water management in the basin. And so we really feel like there needs to be a solution that works for agricultural operators that also can help address the shortfalls that we face today. So that's what really motivated our work and our partnership with the Western Landowners Alliance on this research, is really trying to understand, how do farmers and ranchers see the opportunity and the solutions that that we might move forward in the face of climate change and addressing this unfolding crisis. And so we had 3 primary research goals. We really wanted to understand the concerns and perceptions of farmers and ranchers around water management in the basin. We wanted to understand what are they currently doing to conserve water or different adaptation strategies that they've already adopted or would consider adopting in the future. And we wanted to understand their current participation or interest in participating in formal water conservation programs going forward. So with those 3 research goals, we developed a survey that we sent to farmers and ranchers across the basin to get input on each of these 3 kind of buckets of research goals. And we collected a lot more data than I'm able to share today, but I'll point you to some resources if you want to dig in a little bit deeper on some of the other data that we collected. So we sent out a mail survey. It was a systematic random sample that we developed that was stratified across 6 states. So we excluded Nevada from our survey design because there's very little, if any, agricultural water use in Nevada that is reliant upon surface water from the Colorado Basin. And so we surveyed in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And you can see the number of responses that we got there. And we stratified our sample to be roughly proportionate to the number of unique agricultural water users in each of those states. And it was a mail-based survey with an online option for people. But the way we contacted people was using county assessors data, using GIS. We overlaid parcels with county level assessors parcels with irrigated fields to identify irrigated properties. And then we use the contact information from those county assessors data to send out the mail survey. And we received over 1,000 total responses across those 6 states, and averaged just above a 20% response rate. But that response rate was much higher in the upper basin that I'll note, and significantly lower in the lower basin. It was about 7 to 10% in the lower basin. And in the upper basin, in some states like Wyoming, it was over 30%. So much higher response rate there. So there's a little bit of some caveats in some of our results that with the lower basin. And we have it was a complex sampling challenge that I'd be happy to elaborate on more if people are interested, but just want to sort of note that some of our results, maybe feeling very good about our results in the upper basin and less good in the lower basin. And I would just say that 20% response rate is about the industry standard right now. It's not great, but it's just kind of where we're at with survey-based research like this anymore. I'll just note a handful of limitations with our study design. Identifying and contacting irrigators was a big one. We relied on that county parcel data, some of which varies in how current it is with updated owners, and also challenges with contacting lessees. So in places where people are leasing out their land, it was much tougher to get in touch with them if they weren't the landowner. So some of the actual owners of the properties, may not have been passing on the survey to folks that are actually making the management decisions around water conservation. And we feel like that was a big part of our lower response rate in the lower basin, which I'll address here in a second. There's always with survey work, a challenge of response bias, meaning that some people that fill out the survey are much more motivated to respond and participate. And those that are much more motivated might be systematically biased in one direction or another in some of their responses. So it's always something we're keeping in mind. And there's a good diversity of agriculture across the basin. So what it looks like in the upper basin, which is largely, cattle operations, livestock operations, using irrigation for hay production, for feed for livestock. In the lower basin, there's a much more diverse set of vegetables and other crops that they're growing there. And so it was difficult to tailor the survey to all the different contexts of what agriculture looks like throughout the basin. And just to give you a quick sense of some of the characteristics of the respondents, even though we had a pretty low response rate in the lower basin, the total number of acreage that they are managing is not that much less than in the upper basin, and on average managing much larger acreage. And we think this is largely due to the fact that agricultural operations seem to be much larger there, a little bit more, less kind of owner operated, probably leasing out pretty extensive tracts from neighbors or others in the surrounding region. And that showed that only about half were owner operated in the lower basin, with 80% in the upper basin, and less than half residing on that property, with nearly 90% residing on the property in the upper basin. So definitely some differences in what ag looks like between the upper and lower basin. So I'll dive into some of our key research goals. One thing I'll just note here really quickly is the way that I'll present these data here. You'll see I've broken them out between upper basin in the blues and green shades, lower basin with the reds and kind of yellow gold colors there. That'll be a consistent color scheme that I'll use as I go through the data here. And then also sort of these trends, the different shades. If it's a stronger shade, it means that there's a stronger agreement with the statement that we had, or the question that we asked, with lighter shading being less strongly agreeing with that statement or question. So as an example of what you can see here. So I think the key takeaway here, we asked about a number of different potential concerns that farmers and ranchers have. The key takeaway is that people are concerned. They're paying attention to this crisis, and they're very concerned about how the implications of this crisis on changes in water management policy, especially changes that might happen at the state level, just some of the doctrines that have been largely enshrined in state water law, and then how those changes in water policy might result in new constraints on water use, both for their operation as well as for their fellow farmers and ranchers, and concern about kind of agricultural viability going forward. Not a major surprise here, but I think that the magnitude of the concern, I think, was pretty striking to us in some of these questions. Nextly, we asked about different perceptions of water management. We asked about their trust in how they felt about state management. In most part, water management is governed by different state laws and state water agencies. And there is some federal involvement, and varies in how strong that federal authority is depending on where you are in the basin. But I think this question here, the only 14 or 13% agreed with the statement that there is a high level of trust between water users and water management agencies in my state, and only 1% agreed strongly with that statement in both the upper and lower basins. So really underscoring the sort of challenges with trust and building buy-in and support with water managers in their states. And that's contrasted with the perspective of really seeing local management as really critical to how water is actually managed. And so that sort of local versus state or federal dichotomy, I think, is something that really came through in a number of our questions. But I think the really low level of agreement with trust in their state water management agencies was perhaps one of the more striking results in our work, that says there's a lot of additional work to be done to build trust to confront this crisis. Our next sort of main goal we had for our research was understanding current water conservation or adaptation strategies. And so we asked about a number of different practices that they are either currently using or have in the past, or adaptation strategies that they're using. And it ranged from things like growing less water-intensive varieties of crops, to permanently reducing the irrigated acreage that they're using, updating or changing irrigation infrastructure to be more water conservation savings, or reducing livestock herds, things like that. I think most strikingly, roughly 70% of the people we surveyed were doing at least one of these strategies, and many more were interested and would consider a wide range of other strategies out there, of the 11 that we looked at. So I think the takeaway here is that people are already adapting. People are thinking about how they're going to change their practices going forward to address these chronic water shortages. Even in many cases, a lot of the folks that have agricultural water rights have some of the more senior, it varies from area to area, but many folks have some of the most senior and theoretically most secure water rights in their areas. Even so, they are still thinking about how they respond to water shortages going forward. And our next bucket of results that we're really interested in was current or previous participation in formal water conservation programs. And this is a very busy graphic slide here, so I apologize for that. But just to walk you through it really quickly, the dark shades here indicate whether they currently or previously participated in a program. The sort of middle shade there indicates whether they would consider participating in those programs in the future. And the lighter shades indicate that they are aware of the program, but have no interest in ever participating. And then the unshaded boxes are respondents that are unaware or are not aware of these specific programs. So just to walk you through those results there. I think perhaps the big takeaway from a relatively complex slide is that there's low awareness of these formal conservation programs, with the one exception being the Natural Resource Conservation Services Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, which is kind of a flagship program for NRCS that does a lot of things, including water conservation. Many people have participated in that currently or in the past and would consider participating. Although we did hear some caveats there that there was a good deal of frustration with sort of the bureaucratic process of enrolling and actually going through the process. It can take a long time to actually enroll and participate. So I think there's some changes that can be made to make that easier for participation for farmers and ranchers going forward. But that sort of flagship program is very widely known. Many farmers and ranchers know NRCS, have existing relationships with NRCS that I think could be leveraged going forward. I think the other one of the more striking results that we have was this very low awareness of the System Conservation Pilot Program, which is one of the sort of primary strategies, especially in the Upper Basin, that states are thinking about and piloting and experimenting with to address water conservation and meet some of their compact compliance obligations. And so in this case, the System Conservation Pilot Program, 88% in the Upper Basin weren't even familiar with that program. So it shows that there's a good deal more work that can be done to raise awareness and to make that a viable program, if that's something that the Upper Basin states continue to pursue going forward. And Max is going to talk about this in a little bit more in depth of some folks that have participated and what their experiences have been like participating previously. Next, we asked about a number of what we called water transfer arrangements that could be made. Really, this could be thought of as kind of water banking approaches. I think the key takeaway here is that, writ large, the agricultural community is very opposed to water transfers, especially permanent forms of water transfers, what's been referred to as kind of buy and dry in places like Colorado, where municipalities are buying out water rights for their own municipal supplies and leaving agricultural operations dry. So I think that the one exception to that was less opposition, I would say, to temporary transfers or kind of water leasing arrangements that are from one agricultural user to another. But in general, I think there's a lot of skepticism and reticence to participate in some of these water banking type of approaches. And I think one of the concerns that's there is that these, even in these temporary transfer arrangements, that could just be sort of the setting the precedent for longer term and more permanent efforts that would move water out of agriculture and would really create lots of challenges for agricultural economies and the viability of these agricultural communities going forward. And we asked about a number of the barriers to water transfers that people saw. And two that really stood out for us was, one, the insufficient financial compensation that was being provided, and perhaps more notably, concern about losing their water rights or jeopardizing their water rights, even if it was a temporary water transfer arrangement. And so even though there's protections in place for many of these water conservation programs that would not subject their water rights to putting them at risk, I think that the sort of use it or lose it principle of Western water law is really still very visceral and very much at the forefront of farmers and ranchers' minds. And so doing anything that might jeopardize that water right, I think, is really something that they are very concerned with. And so when we asked about that System Conservation Pilot Program or programs like it, we asked about 8 different practices that they could do, some of which have already been experimented with by the states that are piloting these efforts. And again, this is another visible or a busy slide that is a little bit difficult to unpack. But just some of the key takeaways, I think, one is that there's very low levels of likelihood of people participating, or very likelihood that they would adopt these different practices as part of a formal conservation program, with a couple of exceptions. I think the first exception is that investments in infrastructure that enhance delivery systems. So things like lining canals, many times these water ditches are dirt, and the water can seep into the groundwater. So lining those so that they don't lose that water is something that is very much of interest to a lot of folks, as well as other infrastructure improvements like moving to center pivots that in theory can conserve water. I will say that there's some challenges with using an infrastructure type of approach to really address or to reduce consumptive use that Max will elaborate on a little bit more. So that is a sort of a viable strategy writ large, may not achieve the water conservation savings that are needed. I think the other sort of exception, and something that was a surprise to us, the next highest level of practices were what we're calling collective practices, where everybody in a tributary or ditch system irrigation district would adopt the same practice, or would commit to reducing their water use by a certain level, which that sort of collective nature, I think, surprised us that there was interest in that. But when we talked to some of the water users, out in the field, what we heard is that they're already having to coordinate with each other and how they manage these ditch systems and infrastructure systems. And so if there was going to be a conservation practice that they were going to adopt, they would already have to be coordinating with their neighbors anyway. And so it just seemed to make more sense that that's how they might enroll in these programs is more as a group of operations rather than individually. And so I think that suggests that there could be a lot more capacity directed to working and trying to deliver some of these conservation programs at that more collective kind of level, like at a irrigation district level or across an entire irrigation ditch system. And then the last bit of data that I'll present is we asked about if there was some sort of system conservation program that was put in place that was permanent, who would they want to administer that program? And again, just, not a surprise to us, but maybe the magnitude was a surprise, just this overwhelming preference for local agency involvement, locally driven solutions, state agencies being, a far second, and then a lot of skepticism and mistrust around federal agencies and involvement of the federal government. So just to kind of summarize our key findings, what we're taking away from this, is that there's a high level of concern about the potential impacts to water use in the agricultural community. But I think this is really encouraging that 70% are already responding to water shortages and considering other practices or adaptation strategies they might adopt going forward. However, there's a very low awareness and interest in participating in formal programs. And there's a good deal of resistance to water transfers, with the exception being temporary transfers from ag to other ag users. And there's still this major concern about abandonment and forfeiture, or this use it or lose it approach to doctrine within prior appropriation that I think really needs to be addressed. And even if it's formally addressed through the policies of these programs, really needs to be communicated in ways and building relationships where people actually believe that. And then finally, there's just an overwhelming support for local approaches that people really want to see local solutions rather than more top-down approaches. So with that, I will turn it over to Max, who's going to take a deeper dive into two subbasins in the upper basin.
Yeah, thanks, Drew, and thanks, Heather, for hosting us today. It's an exciting opportunity to present on some of my research that is very much so nested in the findings that Drew has presented on. So you'll hear a lot of these same themes, but hopefully that will provide insights from the field and from conversations I've had speaking with ag producers and folks that deliver programs. The goal of my research is to document and understand the factors of the water conservation program and adoption in agricultural communities in the upper Colorado River Basin. To complete that goal, I tried to hone in on a relatively small study area, which is the Green River Basin and the Yampa River Basins of Colorado. These are high elevation headwaters basins that contribute significant flows to the Colorado system as a whole. These basins most of the reservoir storage and the water storage is downstream of irrigators in these basins. So a lot of folks are diverting water from rivers and streams and putting them out onto their landscape. And so they're somewhat at the mercy of annual or perennial flows that come down as snowmelt to provide for their agricultural operations. These two basins are valuable to study as they share a lot of similarities in the programs that are offered to agricultural producers, yet they're also different in the state water laws that govern them, as well as the economic diversity and population density within these two basins. To complete my research, I set out to conduct interviews with agricultural producers, as well as agency and not-for-profit personnel. And in the course of those interviews, I sought to better understand the program structures of the programs that are being provided and are intended to conserve water in these locales, as well as to investigate the role of the facilitator or the intermediary who works between the funding agency and the agricultural water producer, and then of course to understand the point of view of the agricultural water user as to why or why not a program might be enticing for their operation. Next slide, please. And through my research, I came out with a few themes that I want to share today and expand upon what Drew already presented. First theme that came up often was the role of trust and also mistrust. First, I want to touch on the fact that a lot of agricultural producers in these upper basin areas trust in their current operations, trust in the management techniques they've used for oftentimes decades or generations, i.e. flood irrigation. Folks use flood irrigation to apply water to their irrigable acres, which grows hay and grass crops that oftentimes feed cows and then provides their income via that. People see a lot of multiple benefits from flood irrigation, both operationally as well as ecologically and to the hydrograph. People see that flood irrigation can provide wetlands that are aesthetically pleasing and provide a habitat for animals that they like to see on their property, as well as a lot of folks believe and know that this slows down water in the landscape and keeps water in the upper basin areas for a longer period of time, providing return flows to downstream neighbors and irrigators, as well as to the rivers and creeks that they live on. I also found a theme of mistrust. There's a relatively high level of mistrust between agricultural producers and different levels of government. This may ring true in other parts of our society as well, and ring true in our survey results. Just to highlight that level of mistrust, I'll share a quote from a producer who said, "I'm more worried about being shorted water by policy changes than I am by climate change. I think we're in natural climate cycles, and what we need to be concerned about is what the government, either the state of Wyoming or Bureau of Rec, is going to do with water policy." So this producer shared a sentiment that was somewhat widespread with folks I talked to, that people are really concerned with how policy could change, and concerned that maybe the prior appropriation system that they've worked with for so long could be impacted by water shortages and increase in demand for water. In my conversations, I also found significant pathways to trust and engagement. The key finding I really had is that a lot of times trusted individuals play a tremendous role in creating program engagement and building trust between multiple parties. These individuals often work for an agency or not-for-profit, and they're folks who live and work within the community and have built that trust via engaging in somewhat low-risk voluntary incentivized programs that often change management action, and via success stories in those programs, then those folks are able to engage agricultural water producers in riskier programs, such as the System Conservation Pilot Program, which incentivizes people to leave their fields fallow and kind of abandon growing their crops for that year. And then, of course, incentives play a role. If the incentives match the needs and desires of the end user, that's going to play a tremendous role in the outcome. In relation to water leasing in Wyoming, one person told me, in Wyoming, you hang your hat on who you are and what you do. And in Western Wyoming, people are skeptical of the federal government until they start writing checks. So yeah, incentives play a big role. And of course, it's hard to pass off a check without your foot in the door. So the trust needs to be there as well. About my conversation, as well as in our survey results, the preference for irrigation infrastructure improvements. A lot of people who have been able to put modern or more efficient irrigation infrastructure on their properties see multiple benefits in that a lot of times it reduces the labor costs and time that it takes to put water out on a field, and as well as increases the productivity of the acreage where there is improved infrastructure. But it's been kind of widely known by agricultural producers, policymakers, and funders that a lot of these programs historically have not resulted in a reduction in consumptive use. From the point of view of one producer I spoke to, they said, I put in one pivot because the writing was on the wall for the future of water in the basin, and it has created efficiency in my irrigation system. I put in the pivot as a means to grow more hay with a cost share through the NRCS. The pivot was to help with my consumptive use, but did not reduce the amount of water that I run in my ditch. I just started putting saved water on lands I didn't normally irrigate. So this producer sees the value in adding these systems, but also understands that that freed up water to make them more productive and potentially help their bottom line. And that's something that is understood by policymakers, and from that understanding, temporary water leasing programs, the system conservation pilot program, and potentially in the future demand management programs. Drew gave a pretty good definition of the system conservation pilot program, which is to temporarily, voluntarily lease water from agricultural producers, and thus hopefully reducing the amount of consumptive water use in headwaters areas. So far, that program is not accounting for water delivered downstream to reservoirs that can be used by lower basin states, but it is piloting such an action that could contribute to flows for others downstream. That's been misconstrued with buy and dry, and that buy and dry has that buy and dry practices and those exploitative practices that have happened historically really seem to act as a barrier between people wanting to engage in temporary water leasing. Just to kind of highlight some of that skepticism of leasing, one producer I spoke with told me that water connects us more than we realize. SCPP, or demand management, seems like a great idea on the surface. The program is proactive and out in front of an issue. The difficulties are in actually instituting and managing the program. In Wyoming, you would need to tinker with water law, which is not a good idea. Even if it is to shepherd water or to declare storage as a beneficial use, it's just not a good idea. This producer is showing a lot of trust in the prior appropriation system and Wyoming water law in the way that it works to try to keep water on the lands and on working agricultural lands. And they see a lot of risk in changing any law or providing incentives that kind of free up a water market, because they don't want to see agriculture diminish in a headwater system. Yet the financial incentives provided by temporary water leasing are real, and they've made a positive impact on making a number of agricultural operations more resilient in the two watersheds in which I studied. One producer told me that SCPP allowed me to manage water for grazing rather than for hay production. For me, that was a win-win. The price I received for my water lease was inspiring. It added about 100 grand to my revenue. So yeah, participating in SCPP made a dent and allows me to operate at break even or even for a profit. That producer noted that operating for a profit in his line of business is a rarity and is something to celebrate. And other people I talked to noted other ways that the financial incentives provided via water leasing via the SCPP program allowed them to make their operations more resilient, and that gave them funds to improve their infrastructure, whether that be blown out earthen ditches, to cover the costs of replanting fields either with the same crop or switching crops during a year where they otherwise wouldn't be productive, or to rebuild degraded livestock enclosures with funds that they didn't have in the past. Yet all the people I talked to, whether they were enrolled with the SCPP or were not interested in the program, are concerned about the externalities, the external impacts such a program would have on their operation. The person pictured here is pointing to some weeds that have come up with the lack of irrigation water. The emergence of weeds on lands that are not irrigated is a real concern and something that's been proven to happen. And the cost of returning to production after that weed incursion could be substantial. Some people noted that the loss of soil moisture because of the lack of flood irrigation could have impacts beyond just one growing season and into the future. There could potentially be deferred maintenance or degradation of irrigation infrastructure that isn't used for a year. And then there's also social and community-wide economic impacts that people see real concerns with if temporary water leasing were to expand in their area. Potentially the reduction of hay production in a local area could drive up prices for those who do need to provide hay for feed for cattle in the winter. There's a loss of jobs and lessees who historically used to lease grounds. They may no longer be able to do that because that ground is now has that water leased for SCPP, and a loss of relationships. I heard some pretty heartbreaking stories of relationships breaking down over involvement in such programs. And to conclude, just a reminder, we're working towards water conservation, and the programs that we're studying only offer a drop in the bucket, but they offer a great start, and they show a lot of promise to potentially providing water on behalf of the basin. These programs are most likely to be successful if they're structured around providing infrastructure incentives that also have some sort of binding agreement that reduces consumptive use. And to get programs off the ground, there needs to be trust. There needs to be both a network of both agencies and NGOs who are actively working in the community so that people have a variety of options to choose through, or I guess a variety of agents they can work with and build trusting relationships with. And then the effective trusted individual ends up really implementing a program. And then incentives. Incentives need to be rolled out with understanding of the potential for externalities. Agricultural producers most likely understand the externalities that they could incur better than a policy maker does when considering a change in management actions. And then finally, the ag producer. The agricultural water producer is looking for resilience. Folks are experiencing climate change, they're experiencing water shortage, and they're having a hard time making ends meet. And so thus, a lot of these programs can provide economic incentives that build resilience for the producer on the ground. And I'll pass it back to Drew for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, just so to kind of wrap up, I think I would argue that the Colorado River Basin is really a canary in the coal mine for how we're facing the climate crisis in the United States and globally right now. We're really seeing very significant ramifications that are impacting people's lives in very tangible ways. And so I think, again, just going back to my opening remarks, what are the lessons that we can learn, the questions that we can address from studying the Colorado River Basin? I think that there's many, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface, and this will be an unfolding challenge as we continue to go forward in the years and decades ahead. But a couple of insights that I think that both Max's work and the survey work that we did provide. I think that it's encouraging to see people are adapting. They want to adapt. They're looking for opportunities and strategies. So I think that's encouraging. Working with the agricultural community, there is an openness there to experimentation and thinking about new ways of doing things. But these solutions really need to be tailored to their individual operations and their local context. So how do we continue to develop solutions that really do meet those localized needs? And recognizing that these solutions, some of the survey work that we presented, there may not be overwhelming interest in participating in some of these programs or adopting certain practices, but really seeing this as a portfolio of strategies that we have to address this crisis going forward. It's not an election. We don't need a 50% or more to adopt these things, but 10, 15, 20% in a number of programs and practices collectively can make a big contribution towards the overall water deficit that we're facing. And again, just not rocket science here, but really building trust is going to be critical. If we just think about developing strategies that are top down and just trying to throw money at the problem, is probably not going to get us where we need to go. And so I think really investing in the capacity of some of the intermediaries that Max talked about with SCPP is going to be absolutely critical for building that trust and buy-in and support. And that could hopefully lead to more support locally. And again, if this is not perceived as local solutions that are meeting local needs, then I think we're going to struggle to really get to where we need to go. And so getting it out of the sort of top-down solutions, but finding ways that it's supported by the top with funding and other capacity investments, while really being driven by local solutions, I think will be absolutely critical. So with that, if you would like to dig into our results more, you can go to this website, uwyo.org. colorado.edu/CRB-survey, where you can download the full report of our survey work. And also on that same URL, you can find a data dashboard where we have all of our data that we collected in a survey that can be filtered by state results or different types of agricultural operations if you want to explore the data in a lot more in depth. And with that, we would welcome continue the conversation here on the webinar, or please feel free to reach out to me, either me or Max, going forward. And I know many of you are already doing some of the important work out on the ground on here, and would love to continue that conversation. So with that, Heather, I'll turn it over to you for facilitating any questions that anybody might have.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Drew and Max. I'll give you like a quick round of applause there. We do have a couple of questions. Andrew Mitch is wondering if there's any progress towards shifting from water intensive crops like alfalfa, or if you saw any of that in any of your results.
It did come up in, not necessarily shifting away from alfalfa, but it had come up with, I know some producers that are experimenting with different varietals or sort of different forms of alfalfa that they're hoping is can be less water consuming. I think that there's still a lot of questions and seeing how that works, but I think there's a good deal of interest there for folks. I think it's just figuring out what that right thing is, what some of those other crops or other varietals might be. Somewhere in the lower basin, there's a lot of experimentation. We talked to somebody down there who's experimenting with a plant from, I'm spacing out on the name of it right now, but from Africa that can be used to turn into rubber as an alternative for tire production. And so I think there is some early sort of things that people are experimenting with, but I don't think anything is really caught on quite yet to be, kind of implemented at scale.
Okay, thank you. And then Christina Morset is wondering if you have any ideas or resources on how NGO folks in rural areas can build trust with ag producers, especially when staff are like outsiders or not already from that community.
Yeah, I was gonna say it helps when you come from
Right.
that community already and have those relationships. But I think the thing that I'll see if Max has other insights here. But I think just showing up where people are showing up, and you have those informal interactions. So figuring out where the coffee shop where some of those ag producers are meeting. Just being a presence in the community. I think having that, if you're only meeting with people when it's the formal sort of presentations or outreach events and things, I think that doesn't go all the way. So I think that's the one thing that could support that. I don't know if Max has any other insights from from some of your interviews.
Yeah, I think the insight I can add may not be too helpful, but I think I'd just add persistence. Some of the people that I've seen that have successfully enrolled people in programs that are perceived as risky have been around for a long time. And thankfully they had organizations that backed them up and allowed them to stay in that community. And they grew to live and love that community. And I think that's a hard thing that a lot of organizations struggle to staff, is both good staffing in rural areas. And then of course, you want to be able to produce outcomes rapidly and often, but I think it takes a building period.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, sorry, I just thought of this, but not necessarily in the Colorado River Basin, but I've seen NRCS has had some partner biologists in other parts of the country, like the Midwest and the Great Plains, where they've been working with NGOs to sort of implement some of those farm bill programs. And one of the sort of concerns that's been raised is that oftentimes these are really good like entry level positions, but somebody gets a year or 2 years of experience. Just as they're starting to build headway and build those relationships, they get promoted into a new position elsewhere. And so there's a sort of revolving door phenomenon that I think occurs. So I think that's a risk with these. So having, finding people that can be committed there for longer periods of time where you can, relationship building is not a quick process. I think having a little longer tenure in a location would be fantastic.
Yeah, that longevity is definitely key to building a lot of that partner trust. Excellent points. Thank you. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to maybe raise your hand so that we can kind of make sure that we get to everyone. We've got time for a couple more questions, so feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourselves. Otherwise, I have some, but I'm going to wait. Just
Hi, Diana Lane with the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, and hi, Max. This is great. I'm curious, just, when you talk sort of generally about survey bias and kind of seeing the results and in the interviews, do you have a sense of which way the bias kind of leaned? Like, is it like, I'm going to fill this out because I hate all water conservation programs and I want you to know that? Or did the bias lean toward, like, oh, like I was a participant, or, I know about this and want to, talk more about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I should just I guess caveat that survey bias is always, or response bias is always something that can come into surveys. We don't actually know if we actually have survey bias or not. I mean, there's some different ways that you can kind of look at that. One of the things that we can compare sort of like places where we have really low responses. So like California had so the fewer responses, lower response rate. And so the probability that you get survey response bias in those places is higher. So we did look at sort of differences between places where we had lower responses versus higher responses. And we didn't see really much difference. So it's not necessarily a sign that we have that survey bias, but I don't think we have a good sense of what that direction would be, I guess, so to speak. So I guess I can't really speak to that. I mean, I do feel like we have a pretty good swath. I think that just the overall number of responses that we have, in the fact that they're relatively consistent across the study area, I think is, encouraging that there's not some sort of systematic thing going on. But there's some other sort of checks that we need to dig into a little bit more, but none of them are perfect because we don't have contact or information from the people that don't respond. So I think that's the challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think my interviews were definitely biased towards folks that were rather well informed about the suite of voluntary incentivized water conservation programs that exist. I did work hard to speak with people who are both interested in such programs and folks that weren't, and I think I was able to capture points of view from both sides. But I would say I was not able to access maybe the community of folks who responded as not being aware of programs, as you saw in those survey responses. That's a pretty substantial community across the basin, and I think in both the watersheds that I focused in as well. And that was just a challenge of creating that network and having a rather short time period. And I think it's something that agency and NGO professionals experience as well, as a hard time getting through or getting information across that community, and somewhere there's a lot of work to be done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I want to be kind of cognizant of our time. I know that Drew and Max said that they would be able to stick around for a few minutes after the webinar to kind of continue this discussion informally. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thank you all very much for being here. And if you can join me in thanking our presenters one more time, that would be great.
Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
All right. See if I can actually stop.